Hi guys, and welcome to today's concept video, which is about disturbance events in rats. So I hadn't heard the word disturbance event until a few years ago when I was watching a video by Grover Greenfield, who for many years has run a rat rescue in Australia. And in her video she mentioned disturbance events, and I thought what a great concept that is for describing the major life events that rats struggle with so much. So what are disturbance events? Well, we could say that they're really any event that brings change in a major way into the rat's life, and therefore on the back of that brings stress. And obviously, in each different context for different disturbance events, there are going to be lots of other things that come into play that increase the stress levels. So, for instance, as an example, if a rat has just lost a closely bonded cage mate, they are going to react differently to that death than they might if a rat that they were not particularly attached to died. So other emotions such as grief or fear can kick in. It depends on the context of the disturbance event. So there are many things that can be classified as a disturbance event. And we're going to look at those in a minute. But that was just to give you a rounded picture of what a disturbance event is. To us, it doesn't have to be a major event. It just has to be an event that, to the rat, disrupts their normal feeling of safety in the predictable cycle of their life. So something that brings change and triggers them in the sense of increasing anxiety and maybe pushing the neophobia buttons. So rats as a species, I would say, are particularly susceptible to disturbance events because they have a much higher need than many animals for felt safety. This is obviously an adaptation because they're prey animals, so the need to feel safe keeps them safe, and so it's finely honed. There are other species like this that we are familiar with, like horses, for instance, are very similar. They're animals who will just make a mountain out of a molehill if something is different that they can't make sense of. They automatically assume danger. There are various things about rats that make them particularly susceptible. One is, as we've seen, there is a temperamental trait that is an anxiety spectrum, and all rats fall on there somewhere. But obviously, an average rat is going to be moderately anxious, and we could say that 50% of rats are more than moderately anxious. The other trait that goes hand in hand with that is neophobia. We often think of pet rats as not really being very neophobic, but we can see in many ways that they are neophobic. They don't like difference, they don't like change. They can cope with small change on a regular basis, but they don't like big changes. And there are other reasons that are not temperamental traits. The fact that they are a prey animal, and that makes them more susceptible to anything that they perceive to be danger. They're also animals who are genetically programmed to be part of a strong in-group socially and to resist the out-group. So that means that things like introductions bring stresses with them. And I would say they're also one of the pets that we have that has really sort of like low levels of agency often. We have to work to give rats choice and control over their lives because otherwise, because they're small, we can very easily dictate what happens in their lives. So to not have control even over your own space and your body is quite a significant thing and can be very stressful. And having high agency, having a lot of the perception of choice and control over your environment, it's really important part of the fundamental makeup of mental health in animals. That need for agency, the need for choice, the need for the perception at least of control. And with caged animals, well, immediately their environment is as big as we make it. Their world is as big as we make it. And then within that world, it's up to us to provide options so that they can make decisions, so that they can organise their environment how they want it, so that they can choose whether to drink water out of a bottle or a bowl. They seem really small things to us, but that is the extent that our rats are going to be able to control their world. And it's essential that we provide those things. Body space and where your body is in space is so personal and so tied in with mental health. And we just whisk them up and move them around and plonk them down. And we very rarely ever ask for permission. And I can say that with my hand on my heart because I watched so much video of rats behaving in certain ways. And in those videos, I see repeatedly humans behaving in the same way. So that is, you pick them up, you move them around, you do this, you do that, but not stopping to ask for permission. And obviously I don't mean verbally asking for permission, but for instance, if you want to pick up a rat, if you reach your hand towards them, I would personally say keep that at ground level so it's not coming from over the top of their head. If you reach your hand towards them, if they retreat from you, they're refusing permission in that moment. If we still pursue and go and pick them up, then we violated that right that they have over their own body and the space that they're in. So that's just a really important thing to think about, because if you are an animal with low agency who has very little choice or control over their world, then you are very much more likely to feel anxious and for mental health to be an issue. So if you're starting from that place, disturbance events are going to have a much bigger impact. So those are some of the reasons why rats are actually susceptible to disturbance events. And there's a lot of evidence around the effects of disturbance events. They're not called that in the scientific literature, and they're often not called that in the rat world, but that is nevertheless what they are. They disturb the rat's life, and sometimes to an extreme degree. But there is an awful lot of scientific evidence that the sort of events that we call disturbance events are actually things that can produce extreme stress responses in rats. There's also a lot of anecdotal evidence about the effects of disturbance events, about how they affect behaviour, about how they might affect health, because obviously with stress, the immune system sometimes struggles to keep up and infection can come in on the back of that. And rats, again, are a species that are quite susceptible to infection in the face of stress. It's easy to find a lot of evidence to support the concept that disturbance events are bad for rats, essentially. The rats who are going to be the most susceptible to damage from disturbance events are the rats who are at the higher end of the anxiety spectrum, and the rats who are more neophobic, those who are more cautious, less outgoing, those who have had perhaps repeatedly stressful events in their life up to the point of the disturbance event. So there are lots of events that are stressful, which might not necessarily be called a disturbance event. So, I mean, as for an example, let's talk about handling babies, as we were talking about in the previous video. That's known to cause stress to the babies, but we wouldn't call a minute of handling the babies a disturbance event. Yet it still causes stress to the rat. So it's important to realise that rats can have a lot of stress going on in their life without it necessarily be a disturbance event. That might just be their life and the way their life has been. But then we get other rats who are literally suffering one disturbance event after another. So for instance, the rat who we started off with in the Bill and Ben video, he'd been separated from his family, his genetic family. He'd been alone. He'd been dumped outside, he'd been outside alone, he'd been found, he'd been taken to a rescue, he'd been at a fosterer's. He had then been moved to his forever home. He then had to go through introductions. He then went and got castrated. All of those things that I've mentioned would be considered a disturbance event. So he had had multiple repeated disturbance events over a fairly short period of time. And for a rat like that, it doesn't take much at all for something to be the last straw. Now, as it is, he was homed into an excellent home where he's been able to receive what he's needed, and he's now settling into a different life. But sometimes those disturbance events that lead up to that are inevitable. You know, once it got to the point of him being picked up from outside, certain things had to happen. There had to be certain periods of being alone. And when introductions failed miserably, he had to be castrated, and there had to be more disturbance events. So these things are not necessarily within our control, but they are something that we absolutely need to be aware of, because often we see changes in behaviour, and we could see that in the Bill and Ben video, that Bill's behaviour was not normal rat behaviour in the face of another rat. And he was literally just terrified. And that's just getting into the point of hyper arousal, where he's no longer able to do anything other than just scream, which is what he was doing. Now imagine if he'd then gone on to be rehomed again or something like that, and you can easily see how the damage is done over time. So let's look at some of the things that we might call a disturbance event. I tend to separate these into mild to moderate and then serious to severe. And the mild to moderate disturbance events are often things that we wouldn't even consider to be a disturbance event. So the one that springs to mind readily is a full cage clean. For a rat, that's a disturbance event. Imagine you went to work one day and you came home and your entire house had been emptied out, moved around, and to some extent new belongings had been put in there, and stuff that you maybe didn't even recognise and certainly didn't seem familiar to you. That's kind of what you're dealing with as a rat every time there's a full cage clean. And it is quite a disrupting thing, and something that can make a lot of rats anxious. Now, this has been studied in lab rats living in a semi-natural environment, and that eager rushing around the cage and sniffing everything and being really hyper and frantic when they first go back into a new cage is so easily interpreted as excitement and almost playfulness, that they are busy exploring. It isn't. It's a stress response, and that has been studied and shown to be a stress response. And from what we know about rats and what they need, it's kind of really obvious that it would be a really stressful thing. I would say we're looking at things of that level when we're talking about the sort of mild to moderate disturbance events. And they might be things like a doe having a stillborn litter. That might, for some does, be a major event. There might be a big grief response, but often within 12-24 hours, a rat will be able to just slot back in with their cage mates and things like that. I would say that's probably moderate, but could be severe. And then you got something like the death of a cage mate who is not a significant player in the team. So for rats, it's all about, the social thing is all about relationship in the sense of how it all fits together and how it works. And sometimes people can really see the difference in their rats after a priority individual or alpha has died. And the reason for that is, it's not necessarily because the rats were bonded more to that rat, it's because they've lost their North Star, the direction point, the protection, the felt safety that they had, the confidence that that individual gave the group is gone, and therefore they all feel like they're lost at sea. So there's a not very ratty metaphors, but they do communicate to us humans. So some other things that might be considered mild to moderate disturbance events would be things like moving the cage within the same room but to a different position. Perhaps getting a new pet in the house that is not a predator. Some illness could be a moderate disturbance event, having to have medication, feeling unwell. Yeah, so those are the sort of things that we're talking about. And then if we look at the more serious to severe, we're talking about more the sorts of things that happened to Bill. So all those moves, whether it's moving away from the home where you were born, whether it's moving away from your family entirely should be protected from wherever possible. Ideally, babies should always go with at least one other sibling. But on occasions where that's not possible, then losing your entire family is a serious disturbance event. Moving home, whether that's moving out of your original home where you were bred, or whether it's finding yourself needing to be rehomed. A serious illness, surgery, spending an overnight at the vet's, moving rooms in the house, bringing in another pet who is a predator, and then grief, whether death is more like the priority individual or perhaps a defender, where the group itself has kind of been disintegrated to some degree. And yeah, those are the kinds of things that would be considered serious to severe. Those were a few of both categories. They certainly weren't the full spectrum of things that we would consider to be disturbance events. But we can see from them that that's quite a lot of things, many of which we know that our rats are going to experience. So it's important to just see them for what they are. And for many rats, particularly breeder-bred, confident rats who go to great homes, so they've never had any particular large stresses or problems other than moving from one of those homes to the other, they will most likely sail through what seem like quite difficult disturbance events. If those happen in a stacking sort of way, so if we're talking about one event, yes, but if they had 2 or 3 or 4 serious disturbance events one after the other, then that could also be problematic. But confident, well-rounded, low anxiety, low neophobic rats are not going to just be demolished by a disturbance event, but some rats might be, depending on their history and their temperament. So it is important to be aware that these things do cause problems for rats, and then to try and look for ways, if you have rats amongst your groups who are not as robust, not as resilient, who you know are more anxious or more affected by change, then just to be aware of the changes that are likely to cause them problems. And then there is the possibility of factoring things in. For instance, one that we haven't mentioned yet is major renovations, building work, noisy work in the house. That can be very stressful for rats. It's unpredictable and it feels threatening, and it can be sporadic, and those kinds of noises and the smell that will come with the machinery that's used, the smell that comes from the paints and things like that, all of those things can be part of the stress for rats. But it's predictable from your point of view. So you know when the people are going to come. If you know something like that's going to happen, give it space around it, so before and afterwards, as far as is possible. Give the rats a really quiet, unchanging time. It isn't always possible, and we can only do our best. There's no judgment about any situation where somebody is trying their best and it still hasn't worked out okay. But all I'm saying is, if you have the luxury of knowing there's going to be something coming up that's a disturbance event, and it doesn't have to be the DIY, it could actually be something like they're going for surgery or you know you're going to be getting some adult rats for introductions. These are all things that would generally know a little bit ahead of time. So that's the time to just increase their felt safety. So no big cage cleans, no big moves around the room or to a different room, and just allow them time to chill. What I've built over the past, this is the fourth concept video, and there's one more, I think, before December. And what we're building is actually a big scenario of those things that come together and have the greatest impact on a rat's well-being. And we haven't balanced that at all by talking about how we address these things, what we can do. And what we can do is always significant. So that comes in December. So don't get too overwhelmed or worried about the fact that a lot of these things compounding to make what sounds like all rats should be just falling to pieces all the time, which they're not. Realistically, we know they're not. But I think we have to accept that, and I hope that through the behavioural videos that's coming out more and more, we have to accept that we're actually quite bad at deciding whether a rat is stressed or not. Okay, so one of the things that's important is to think about what rats, well, what any of us, any mammal needs in order to process an event like that is coming in and causing them to be anxious and overwhelmed. Now for rats, one of the big needs in that situation is felt safety. So we can look at how can we make the rats feel more safe. And a great example of this is the advice given when you've got babies who come in who are not confident, who are hiding away and get overwhelmed very easily by things that are going on in the environment. And the advice from people is, I will take away their hides and then you'll be able to get at them more easily and they'll learn to trust you. And that makes zero sense to me, absolutely zero, because what you're doing is exposing them. So you're stripping away any felt safety that they did have, which was already very low. And how can they trust you if there is no felt safety? Trust is about that coming to that point where they feel safe with you. So I think we have to say that felt safety is a priority and that we need to do everything we can to make the rats feel safe. I mean, I had a group of breeder bred girls. There was 5 of them. They were living in a room, a small bedroom, and the whole bedroom was just set up for them. And the floor was a kind of open expanse. And I was watching them and it became really clear to me quite quickly that they weren't enjoying going across the floor. Because it was quite a large expanse of space, then there was a lot of flight going on and they were getting quite sort of jumpy and angsty. And they were confident rats from a really great breeder. And all I did was I thought, what can I do to make it feel safer so they can use the floor? Because they were using the room. The room was sort of built up the sides and everything as well. But they were going around all the high levels and only coming down to the floor if they had to. And I thought, well, there's a lot of space there that they could be using. Because there was no cage bars, there was a standing wheel. So I wanted them to be able to come down and use that. And I also did feed them fresh food off the ground. I mean, the whole cage had card chip bedding. The whole room had card chipped bedding over the floor. It was just like a massive, massive cage. And what I did was put lots of things like, you know, the IKEA step stools that they could easily go underneath, but they were enclosed, covered over, and a couple of long carpet tube inner type of things, just big cardboard tubes basically. And that was enough. That was all they needed. And then they just were much more settled. And they used to make runs between the things so that they weren't out and exposed. I mean, I've seen this twice in rats. I also once got a absolutely massive indoor aviary, and in that situation, and I had 16 girls in it, and the ones that went in as youngsters were just feral essentially. So it was just too much space for the rats, particularly the ones that were younger and hadn't yet built relationship. And it felt a bit similar when they were in the room, because whilst it was a great space for them, it did change their behaviour back more towards wild behaviour. So they would do a lot of running between objects and things like that. They were very tame. They never lost that at all, but came to the room as adults. 3 of them were rehomes back to the breeder, and 2 of them were a pair of girls that I had left from another group. So they were adults when it was them that started in the big room. So they didn't have that thing about not being able to get to know me very well, and it was a lovely living situation for them. But the answer to them not feeling safe was not to take things away, it was to give them something to make them feel safe. And that's just one example of how we can step in when we notice behaviours that indicate that they don't feel safe. Okay, so I think that we'll leave it there, because the other half of this talk, if I was talking on Ratwise for instance, would have been about how we respond to disturbance events, but that will be the content of another video that we'll have, well, 3 videos that we'll have during December. So for now, I will just leave you with that, and I'll see you on the Nature or Nurture at Ratwise Facebook group. Thanks for listening, and if you want to hear more videos ongoing beyond just this event, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Bye.